Let's see. My first encounter with the doctrines of grace. I believe my first encounter with doctrines of grace was in my attempt to preach through the book of Romans. And coming to the 8th chapter, I was approaching the book from, some presuppositions, some ways of thinking about salvation in particular, how men are saved, our part when it comes to salvation, which is my background. My Arminian background was kind of would lead me through texts like these, except I was going through a series in Romans, and by God's grace, when I came to the 8th chapter, I was struck afresh by the work of God in our salvation. I was trying to formulate the text in a way that I understood salvation, in that a lot of it is based upon man's responsibility, but the text was not saying that, especially using words like, the preordination, predestination. Those words were jumping out at me in a totally different way from what I had understood them to mean before. So, by God's grace, I paused and I thought about it, and I thought about that God, that salvation was predetermined by God in a way that I had not thought about it before. And so then I began to run through other texts that I knew that kind of sounded like that, mainly the 9th chapter of Romans. So I read ahead and got to the 9th chapter of Romans when where God was talking about the difference between Jacob and Esau, and that God's choosing of Jacob so that election would stand. And that's the term that really got me, was election. I understood election to mean that God foresaw me believing, accepting, receiving Jesus, and therefore he elected me. But the text wasn't saying that, because if anything is clear from Romans 9 is that God's choice of Jacob was determined prior to their birth and prior to their conception in a real way. And so I had to do a lot of rethinking. That was probably my first encounter with the doctrines of grace, with what we call Calvinism. And so I began to run different references. By God's grace, again, I had a tape series on Romans by R.C. Sproul. And so I think making a hash of preaching through Romans was probably my first encounter.